Buenos días, es un gusto
Good morning,
darles la
everyone.
bienvenida
We are so happy to
al
have you
webinar
here
Integración del
to
Comercio y el
the
Trabajo Decente.
Integration of Trade and
Y
Decent Work
queríamos primero
webinar.
informar que tenemos
First,
canales de
we would like to
interpretación,
let you
dos
know that
canales de
we
inglés
have
y
two
español,
language channels. We
para
have a
que puedan
Spanish and
elegir.
an English channel for
Good
you to
morning.
pick.
It's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, Integrating Trade and Decent Work. And I would like to mention first that you have two interpretation channels in English and Spanish. Bueno, un gusto estar con ustedes hoy para
We
hablar
are
un
so
poco
happy to
sobre
be here with you
una
and talk
publicación del
about this.
Departamento de Investigación de
We will
OIT,
talk about an
Integración del Comercio y
ILO,
el Trabajo
the
Decente, que es una
Integration
publicación
of
del
Trade and
año
Decent
pasado del
Work
OIT
report. This is a publication
en
from
este
last year
webinario
by
vamos a
ILO. And during this
hablar
webinar, we
de esta
will
publicación
actually sit
y las
down and talk
futuras
about this
implicaciones
publication
para
and
América
talk about
Latina
the
y el Caribe.
implications of it for
En
Latin
esta
America
sesión
and the
de hoy
Caribbean. And
tenemos
during our session of
la
today,
participación
we will
de varios
have
panelistas. A
several
empezar con unas palabras
panel
de apertura de
speakers,
nuestra
and
directora del OIT para
we will start
América
with
Latina y el
our
Caribe, Ana
ILO
Virginia
Director
Moreira,
for Latin
y a
America and the
seguir tenemos
Caribbean, Ana
dos
Virginia Moreira.
presentaciones de coautores del
And then
reporte,
we will
Pelin
have
Ricciardi y
two
Franz
panel
Ebert, que se
speakers,
seguirán de
Pelin
comentarios
Sekerler
de nuestro
Ricciardi
colega de la
and
CEPAL,
Franz
José José
Ebert,
Durán.
and our colleague
Eh,
from
y
ECLAC,
por
Jose
último,
Duran.
tenemos las
And
palabras
lastly,
de cierre de
we
Marva
will
Corley,
have closing
de la
remarks
Unidad de
by
Globalización
Marva
del OIT. Entonces,
Corley,
para empezar,
head of the ILO
invito a
Globalization
nuestra
Unit.
directora
So,
Ana
to
Virginia
begin, I
Moreira
would like to
para las
invite our
palabras de
regional
apertura.
director, Ana Virginia
Un
Moreira,
gusto tenerte, Ana
for the
Virginia.
opening words. Nice to have you here, Ana Virginia.
Gracias,
Go ahead,
Tulio.
please.
Buenos días a
Thank you,
todas y todos
Tulio.
os
Good
presentes. Es
afternoon,
gusto
ladies
poder
and
contar
gentlemen.
com a sua assistência
It
e
is so great to have
acompanhá-los
you
neste
here
seminário
and to be
em
with you during
linha
this session, this
sobre a
online
publicação.
webinar about ILO's publication, trade, integration, and decent work. I would like to start by greeting our panel speakers from from the research department in ILO, Mr. Richard and Franz Ebert. They will provide us with two presentations on this publication. Also, Marva Corley, head of the globalization unit for ILO, who coordinated this research and will share some closing remarks after we're done. Also, vision of the Economic Commission for Latin America, ECLAC. He will share some feedback on the publication and also some results related to the impact of trade on the labor market. And of course, we would like to thank the representatives of companies, governments, civil society organizations, unions, workers, academia, and business associations who are with us today. Today, at this event, we are going to talk about the challenge of integrating trade and decent work and how this integration can help the development of supply chains in Latin America and the Caribbean. Our colleagues in the research department have developed an analytical framework which will be presented shortly in two sessions, which not only improves our understanding, but also provides practical steps to align trade and labor market policies to achieve decent work results. This framework does several things. It uses the ILO decent work indicators to carry out an analysis of how trade influences the labor market at different levels. It delves into the complex dynamics of a labor market institutions and policies in the labor market and explores how they can help maximize the positive impacts of trade while mitigating the adverse effects. It analyzes how labor issues are currently reflected in trade and investment policies and explores their potential to address decent work challenges in practice, including several case studies. In addition, it considers strategies to promote the participation of SMEs and supply chains in order to improve employment and working conditions and ensure that trade benefits all. ILO has played a significant role in promoting decent work in the context of international trade since its inception. But the framework we see today is novel, as it is part of the ILO's broader efforts to advance a human-centered approach, framed by its Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work. The ILO has dedicated to promoting fair and equitable working conditions within and beyond borders. And the organization's support and initiatives have been instrumental in addressing challenges and promoting social justice in the global economy. At the end of the presentations on the ILO publication, we will have the valuable comments and contributions of ECLAC to this discussion. And before our closing remarks, we will have a Q&A session that will provide an opportunity to interact with workers, employers, and everyone present today. So, with the interest of its 187 member states and social partners in mind, the ILO has a crucial role in global discussions on trade and labor. This discussion today on mainstreaming trade and decent work offers valuable insights and policy options to advance social justice and promote equity in trade. Thank you very much. Tulio.
Muchas gracias, Ana Virginia, por las palabras de apertura de nuestra directora del OIT para América Latina.
Thank you. These were the opening remarks from our regional director from Latin America and the Caribbean. Now let's move to the presentation from Pelin Ricciardi, Senior Economist, ILO Research Department, giving us an approach on the first part of the report, analyzing the impact of trade and commercial policies on decent work. Pelin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tulio. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, buenos dias, buenas tardes. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today and to have the opportunity to present our work on integrating trade and decent work at the research department of the ILO. Can you put the presentation, please, on? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So, integrating trade and decent work is at once timely and timeless. This is how Adele Blackett, who also participated in the publications that we'll be presenting today, put it. And this is really fitting for the occasion. Integrating trade and decent work is timeless because it has been a long-standing challenge. And this is definitely not a new topic for the ILO. It is embedded in its origins. It is in the constitution of the organization. This topic is also timely because we are in a period of great uncertainty, and trade, including global supply chains, have been undergoing a transformational process. The COVID pandemic, technological change, environmental and geopolitical considerations have rewired the debate about its future and its effects. Next slide, please. Considering its effects, it is largely accepted that trade has had many benefits. It has created jobs. It has lifted millions out of poverty. It has also contributed for women's participation in the labor market, sometimes providing their first formal jobs. But also, trade has created challenges. It has led to job destructions and displacement. It has also increased inequalities between sectors, but also across firms and workers within narrowly defined sectors. So it has created winners and losers. There have also been concerns about the working conditions in trade-related sectors and also in lower tiers of global supply chains. These were related to occupational safety and health issues, employment security, or informality, to mention only a few of them. But then what is the question? The question is, how can we harness the benefits of trade while addressing its challenges? So this question has been asked by many organizations over the last decade. So what is the value, what is the added value of the ILO? Next slide, please. So our objective at the ILO is to move from a trade-centered approach to a human-centered approach. In the heart of the trade-centered approach, there is trade. The focus is trade. And these two spheres, trade and labor, are separated. And the labor market policies are considered flanking policies that are used to address temporal imbalances. While in the human-centered approach, this focuses on people, on their needs. And this approach calls for an alignment of trade and labor policies to address structural challenges. The difference between these two approaches is also reflected in the tools and techniques that are used to look at the impact of trade and labor. So in the trade approach, the tools that are used are more adapted to looking at trade. But the human-centered approach calls for a comprehensive framework that can also be more adequate to look at the impacts of trade on labor. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. No, this one, yeah, that's true. No, the previous one. So in order to achieve that, what are we doing? We have produced many publications at the research department. Here I added the link to our website, and also you can subscribe to our newsletter. So we produce many publications, but we also organize events, seminars, and trainings. So here today we'll be presenting the latest publication, which came out in November 2023. It's a 2-volume publication, which is composed of 18 chapters with 8 country studies representing 5 regions. Many experts participated in this publication. There are some 25 of them. And there are colleagues from the ILO, but also from UNCTAD, WTO, and there are many academics participating. What all chapters have in common is that they consider trade issues, but with a labor perspective. Next slide, please. So today I'll be focusing on the first volume of this publication, and my colleague Franz, he'll be focusing on the second volume. This volume has more of an economic approach. It is composed of 10 chapters and 3 parts. So I'll be presenting these parts that have each of them focuses on a specific topic. Next slide, please. So the first part focuses on indicators and methodologies that are used to assess the impact of trade on labor. And this refers to the comprehensive framework of tools that I was just mentioning. So when we want to look at the impact of trade on decent work, there are some concepts that we have to clarify. First, what is trade? What is decent work? And what are the methodologies that are used to link these both issues? Next slide, please. You can continue. So first we look at the report does exactly that. So we first look at trade policy indicators. So the report clarifies what this means. Trade policy can refer to many different things. It might refer to import-export tariffs. It might refer to non-tariff measures such as quotas, technical barriers to trade. It might refer to a package of trade agreement, the ratification of a trade agreement, or it might simply refer to trade flows or exporting activities of firms. And depending on these measures, the measure used, the findings might vary. So the report insists on that. Next slide, please. So then we turn to decent work. Decent work is a multifaceted concept which refers to different aspects of labor. But if you look at the literature, many studies, they focus only employment and wages. There are more and more studies that analyze the impacts on informality and gender issues, but the studies that are looking at other aspects of labor are quite limited. I put on the right the 10 substantial elements that make up decent work and defined by the ILO, and taking into account these different aspects, such as social protection, decent working time, or social dialogue, helps to have a better understanding, a more complete understanding of the effects of trade on labor. Next slide, please. Then we turn to methodologies that make the link between trade and labor, and the methodologies that are commonly used in the field of economics. These still, in the literature, most of the studies use macro methods, and they do not necessarily take into account distributional aspects. The assumptions that they make on the labor market might be unrealistic. For example, there are assumptions such as full employment and perfect mobility of workers, and these do not allow us to have a better understanding of the effects on labor. So in fact, all methodologies have their strengths and weaknesses. And we also know that there are important data constraints. That's why the report recommends using a mix of methods at the country, sectoral, and micro levels, and a broader set of indicators covering various aspects of labor to have a complete picture of this relationship. So based on the indicators and methodologies that are analyzed in the first part, the chapters in the second part conduct empirical analysis using different perspectives. So in 3 countries, there are 2 studies on Mexico from both a sectoral and micro perspective. There is 1 study on Vietnam from a micro perspective, and there's 1 study on Malawi using a micro perspective. So the first study is on trade and decent work in Mexico's automotive sector. This is written by distinguished researchers from Mexico. I can continue. The paper analyzes the relationship between exports and decent work in Mexico's automotive industry from 2005 to 2019. It uses input-output methods, so data at the sectoral level. The paper starts with the observation that trade liberalization has led to Mexico's export boom, and the country ranks as the 6th largest producer of automobiles today. However, the sector's performance in terms of decent work falls short, and its linkages with the overall economy are weak. You can continue. And the paper finds some negative trends over the period that is studied, so between 2005 and 2019, in terms of working conditions, but also it identifies persistent gender gaps in the automotive industry. Working poverty and low pay have increased during this period, while the share of permanent workers has shrunk. And also, despite some progress, women make up only 1/3 of the industry's workforce. And this increase, which is only 2%, has been very low compared to other sectors. If you look at the total remuneration of women, it stands only at 65% of that of men, and this has decreased substantially over the period that it studies. studied. And women in the industry tend to have a low level of education. 50% of women in the industry, they have only basic level of education. That is why the paper calls the governments to give priority to decent work in their development agenda. So as I said, the objective of the publication is to look at the issues, so the relationship between trade and labor from different perspectives. So the paper that I presented before, it used input-output tables and sector level data. But now I will be presenting a paper which uses microdata and microtechniques. So this is a paper which was written in collaboration between the Research Department and the Ministry of Labor in Vietnam. It is on trade and decent work in Vietnam, insights from small and medium-sized enterprises. So this paper looks at the relationship between export imports and decent work in Vietnam. It uses micro data and techniques. It uses a survey, an enterprise survey, which has an important particularity. In fact, this is a firm level survey, so firms are interviewed, but in all firms, randomly, some workers are interviewed as well. This is a very rare database because usually it is difficult to match enterprise level data with worker level data, which we were able to do with this database. This paper has two contributions. First, it looks at the decent work aspects that are rarely studied in the literature. It starts with the impact on employment and informality, but then it also studies the effects on social protection, and these are represented through health insurance, unemployment benefits, sick leave, occupational safety and health, and this is represented through provision of training on occupational safety and health. The other contribution of the study is that it focuses on SMEs. And SMEs usually they do not participate in trade directly. And they are found to struggle more with offering decent work conditions. They have higher levels of informality, especially those in the lower tiers of global supply chains. But they play a very important role in the economy. In Vietnam, 96% of all firms are SMEs. And this comprises 47% of labor force in the country. So what we find in the study that increase in exports and imports are associated with a rise in employment first. Then we see that, in fact, imports are increase also likelihood of workers having formal contracts, unemployment insurance, health insurance, and sick leave. And we have found no effect on the provision of OSH training. Also, but there are differences between workers, and there is an increased likelihood for young and educated workers of having formal contracts. So what did we find? We find that promoting trade participation of SMEs can lead to gains in employment first, and also working conditions that were represented through social protection. But there are important differences in the labor market outcomes between trading and non-trading firms, and we see that this replicates among SMEs as well. But there are also differences between workers. So young and educated workers seem to profit more from these benefits. So policies encouraging trade need to be accompanied by other policies, such as labor market policies, to ensure that trade benefits all. The two chapters that I presented emphasize the importance of labor policies to make trade more inclusive. But following up on this, the third part of the report deals with labor market policies programs, and they focus on two specific areas: skills development and transition to formalization. The ILO has been very active as well in providing support to countries for ensuring decent work in the context of trade through specific programs and projects. So one program that is highlighted here is the STAT program, which is ILO Skills for Trade and Economic Diversification Program. This program provides qualitative evidence and support on capacities and skills that firms need to strengthen in the context of trade. And it covers 25 countries, mostly in Africa, Asia, and MENA region, and some from the European region. Then the last chapter turns to those innovative ways in which ILO has provided support to ensure decent work. And especially it focuses on the role of the ILO as an observer in the collective bargaining process in Mexico in the context of USMCA. This was done at the request of the Mexican government. In fact, this chapter provides a bridge with to the second volume because it already starts dealing with the question of how labor issues are reflected in trade and investment agreements. So this part will be delved into by my colleague Franz, which is the main topic of the second volume. So thank you, and now I will give the floor back to Tulio so that he can start the second part of the session. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Pelin, que nos brindou uma
Thank you very
apresentação
much, Pelin.
com alguns estudos
She shared a
eficazes
very
sobre
interesting
a relação entre
presentation with some
comércio
case studies
e
on
trabalho decente.
trade
Lamento
relations
novamente
and decent work and
mencionar
how
o
they are
tema
connected.
de las
She
pymes
talked
que
about
pueden
SMEs
beneficiarse de esta inclusión
that can actually
en
benefit
el
from
comercio
this kind of
exterior,
inclusion,
y también tiene relación
specifically
con
focused on
desarrollos
foreign
de
trade.
cadenas de suministro.
She
Aquí
also
trabajan
touched
por
on
una parte
supply
importante de
chains
cadenas de
that
suministro
are
son
an
las pymes,
important part
y esto será
of all
también
this. Supply chains are an important part
objeto
when it
de
comes to
la
SMEs.
presentación de
This
nuestro
will
colega Franz Ebert, que
also
es
be
investigador
connected
en
to
Derecho Laboral del
Franz
Departamento de
Ebert's
Investigación
presentation.
del OIT.
He is a
Y paso la
researcher
palabra a
on
Franz.
labor rights for ILO. He's a research officer in labor law in the ILO Research Department. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to take advantage of this opportunity so I can thank Tulio and the entire team for the entire logistical support and technical support so we can conduct this event. I am very happy to be here with you and show you the second part of our research project, collective research project that deals with investment projects and deal with labor market issues in supply chains. Next, please. So we will talk about four things. First, I will give you the context of the project and its objectives. Secondly, I will share the main results of the project. And third, so I can wrap up with the previous topics, I will talk about a specific regulatory instrument and talk about the instruments so we can prohibit or ban imports or forced labor import bans, and what are the important impacts that these instruments can have on companies and on workers. And I will wrap up with some conclusions. I hope they will be inputs for the Q&A or the debate or discussion we will have later on. Next slide. Okay, next. Okay. Just to give you a little bit of context, it is known that a large portion of trade, somewhere about 70% based on OECD, happens in global supply chains. Since the 90s, Southern countries have been integrating more and more into regional and global production networks, especially in the manufacturing sector. While this process has brought about great benefits, for example, on productivity and reducing poverty, at the same time, this growing integration has mainstreamed deficiencies in decent work when it comes to labor conditions in many parts of the supply chains. Given this situation, the question on how to integrate these issues in the labor market and investment policies, this is all very important so we can come up with capable policies so we can make the labor market sustainable. This has been focused on people who draft policies in the global north, but also in other regions. Next. However, labor issues are usually not seen in multilateral trade scenarios. And given the multilateral, the situation that multilateral scenarios are facing, there are bilateral and plural multilateral scenarios. This is a little bit of the results that come out of this, because a lot of these instruments do incorporate broader and wider commitments past the, beyond the labor market. And there have been some labor market discussions in one of three multilateral agreements, bilateral and multilateral agreements. The last, most of them or half of them were implemented in the last decade. Therefore, commercial agreements that talk about labor issues cover about 140 economies. There is a big variety in the series of terms that have been agreed. So some provisions may establish some minimum standards or compel parties to do this effectively. Also, there is a great variety in implementation mechanisms, which can implement dialogue mechanisms, cooperation mechanisms, solving controversies without implementing sanctions in case of defaulting or lack of compliance. In Latin America, a lot of countries have concluded more than 2 agreements when it comes to labor laws. So Chile has 15 of these commercial agreements with labor dispositions. Peru has 9, and Colombia has 6. Next slide, please. If you are interested in taking a look at this information, there is a database we put together here at ILO that has information on all trade agreements available and their label provisions, and you can actually search keywords when it comes to relevant discussions, so you can take a look at detailed issues. It's actually available online. It is an open source document. But commercial agreements are not the only commercial instruments for labor governance. So say next. Yes, go ahead. We have import bans and unilateral commercial systems, as well as labor commitments when it comes to investments, people's international investment processes, and trying to foster foreign investment. Next, please. And then, of course, a lot of complementary instruments have come up or arisen, so we can focus on labor provisions as well as some sectorial or business-like instruments, as well as some other things that have been adopted in different jurisdictions. Next. Thank you. Given this scenario of a highly populated governance scenario, what we are presenting today is the following. These are some of the suggestions. The first thing we would like to display is, what does this all mean in practice, in the social reality? What have been the effects of these discussions in these commercial instruments and investment instruments, and how do they interact with other governances in the supply chain, and in what conditions can these instruments help us to advance in decent work initiatives? Next, please. With this, we now go to the main results out of the project. Next, please. Let me just show you the structure of the book. Like Helene said, it's available online. You can check it anywhere or anytime you want. The first part of this, well, we analyze different commercial instruments as a tool to promote labor rights in general. The second part of it dwells into practical experiences in 3 regions. In order to put this into context, and the third part of it dives into the possibilities so we can integrate decent work in multilateral trade frameworks. Like Pelin said, stakeholders in several chapters are colleagues with ILO, but also people from academia in different areas, universities and other institutions. We are happy to have the participation of UNCTAD and WTO for parts 2 and 3. Stakeholders come from different disciplines like political sciences, law, economics, and they use different methodologies and focuses, especially qualitative, but some of them quantitative. It is worth mentioning that for each chapter, each of the ones that are in English, we have a short summaries in Spanish with some of the key takeaways, political takeaways. This is up on the website for you to check. So the first part of it, the first chapter, drafted by 3 of my colleagues, authors shed some light on some of the labor provisions in commercial agreements, some led by ideas from Canada, the European Union, and the United States. It analyzes how does this work in practice, monitoring systems or surveillance systems, and resolving controversies. There are also some labor disposition discussions in order to reinforce or relaunch social dialogue initiatives. It also explores a series of interactions between the different implementation mechanisms for an agreement. Next.
And an interesting example as far as those interactions that we see in this chapter is a case that came in the Canada-Colombia agreement. Here we see a partnership between the Canadian and Colombian trade unions giving information to the Canadian government, alleging that Colombia had was not respecting cooperations. There was a claim and there was an agreement between the parts, and that ended up in the creation of an action plan with the participation of the social partners in order to address the issues. It is worth mentioning that in this context and within the framework of this plan, Canada committed to offer assistance in order to solve the issues at hand, which led to several projects, a technical training funded by Canada. The chapter also shares lessons on policies. For example, the importance of early inclusion of the social partners and the importance of using the cooperation mechanisms to include key stakeholders. The second chapter analyzes the labor content and enforcement mechanisms of the agreements. Now we move from trade agreements to investment agreements. And there was always a fear that these investment agreements would restrict the national actions as far as labor issues. The actors go over the different mechanisms of the agreements. It shows that the current investment agreements include even more references to labor issues, but it also highlights that the implementation mechanisms for such treaties are many times weak or null. Therefore, several options are proposed in order to increase the effectiveness, in order to improve the national labor standards and safeguard the scope for relevant national action.
Nel tercer capitolo sondeamos el potencial de diversos instrumentos de
The
gobernanza
third chapter addresses how provisions related to forced labor have been integrated into trade and investments governance instruments. I am going to delve into this in my next presentation, so I'll be brief here. And I will move straight to the second part of the book, focusing on examples from 3 different regions in order to provide contextualized information as to how to develop integration of labor aspects in trade agreements. In that sense, Graciela Benzosan, in the 4th chapter, examines the labor dimension between the Mexico, US, and Canada Treaty and its influence in the important transformation of the labor market institutions in Mexico during the last few years. The author explains how these supported the different initiatives from the political and national actors, showing that this was necessary to overcome internal opposition and reduce the political cost of the reforms. The author also highlights that despite that everything started on the outside, the main characteristics of the reforms did not come from the outside. They were a reflection of the internal demands of the numerous formal and informal debates between trade unionists, legislators, and trade negotiators. This is an interesting chapter to read because of this reason, because it shows these dynamics in a very detailed way. Next, the author examines the different labor relations, including wage provisions in the automotive industry, which is not found in any other free trade agreement as I know. This is very innovative, and it also focuses on another innovative aspect, the fast response mechanism in order to address the different conflicts as of collective bargaining rights in different workplaces. And the chapter uses different cases using this mechanism and how this mechanism has helped to address all the issues related to labor rights in Mexico. I would also like to mention that in volume 1 presented by my colleague Lynn, there is a chapter from Karen Curtis and Elizabeth Echeverria examining the role of the ILO in resolving some of those disputes that came out within the framework and this mechanism of rapid response that I just mentioned, and how the ILO acted as an observer in the legitimization and representativeness of collective bargaining. I believe those 2 chapters are extremely interesting, looked from different governance perspectives. And with a similar approach, the authors of chapter number 5 analyze the influence of the free trade agreement between the European Union and Vietnam in the labor law reform process undertaken since 2019. Authors argue that although the agreement was a catalytic force for the reform, this process must be understood in the context of the Vietnam's internal political dynamics, where reformist actors were able to take advantage of external pressures to push for policy changes. Next slide, please. And the last chapter of this second section, chapter number 6, draws our attention to Africa, especially to the free continental trade agreement comprising about 50 African countries to date. The author examines the economic projections available on the impact of these free trade agreement on the labor market. But he concludes that there are too many studies related to this. And then he proceeds to study the different concerns related to labor issues and with SDG 8 in general, with a legal and institutional approach of this agreement. And it is interesting to mention that in the South-South agreement, even though there are no labor provisions in the main text, the protocol on investments covers state commitments related to labor standards, and it also requires investors to comply with specific labor standards. These are labor dispositions applied to investors and states. In this sense, this is a new approach, a novel approach. And last, next slide, please. Next slide.
Sì, perfetto. Por último, en la tercera parte,
and in the third part, we analyze how to address the structural aspects through governance tools at different levels, including the multilateral trade system. Here, we analyze the trade policies and gender aspects, analyzing WTO agreements, national policies, and specific programs, for example, aid to trade, and how they interact among themselves to promote a hybrid approach in the gender-sensitive trade policy making. It also develops an approach that places women at the center of the trade policy, and it shows how this approach would push the trade market and decent work.
Last but not least,
the authors reflect on agriculture as an example of a sector that is well involved in the trade, presenting issues connected to labor practices and environmental effects. The authors also examine the potential of the current trade policies, including some recent regional trade agreements, stressing the importance of greater coherence between all policy areas. They also propose a new Green Deal as a framework that brings together trade, finance, investment, and employment policies in an environmentally sustainable transition process. And with this, I conclude this tour. We include a landscape or a larger landscape. But I would like to propose to delve into a specific commercial instrument referring to the prohibitions for importation of goods produced with forced labor. I would like to mention that close to 28 million people were in forced labor conditions worldwide, representing an increase of 11% from 2016. Out of these, more than 17 million people were in the private sector, excluding commercial sexual exploitation. And approximately 32% of these people were in export relevant sectors such as manufacturing, agriculture, and lamination. So these are important sectors for supply chains. It is not surprising that this has created a political and regulatory responses in different countries at different levels. And as you can see in this slide, the idea to prohibit imports of goods created with forced labor is not good. In fact, the United States adopted a standard back in 1930, and for a long time they were actually the only country to adopt it. And only in 2020 was that Canada adopted a prohibition, followed by Mexico in 2023. And this is not out of chance, given the fact that the new agreement forces state parties to adopt a prohibition of the manufacturing of goods due to forced labor. In 2021, the United States adopted the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. This is a specific standard to the Xinjiang region that invests on the prohibition of goods coming from this region. So this is an import ban. And that means that those importers that would like to import products from this region need to prove that these goods are not connected to any type of forced labor. And of course, this could be very difficult to prove.
This is with a regulation that will be effective sometime in 2024, so this year. This will be applied as of 2027, most likely. So this is a general ban of products manufactured with forced labor. So this covers imports, exports, and also the internal markets of the EU. So this is a broader approach than other import bans in general. An important feature of all these regulations I just listed is its broad scope. In principle, it can be applied to any single company that would like to export or to trade goods in a specific jurisdiction, and there is no minimum amount rule. If only one little amount is manufactured with forced labor, and it doesn't matter either if the supply chain system is far away from the importer, it will still count. That is why these forced labor bans and these instruments can also have implications for companies in sectors where forced labor is not an issue. And we believe that this is why we have to be updated with these administrative changes. Next, please. So, how do we apply forced labor bans in practice? I will focus on the U.S. Standard or U.S. legislation. This is the one we have most information on or more information available. So, how does this work? In the case of the United States, in principle, there are 3 stages. It starts with the commissioner or customs authorities, they're called CBP. They start an investigation, maybe because they got information specific from civil society, NGOs, or some other sources, maybe the press or some other sources. They start the investigation. This is your first step. And then in the case of a reasonable indication or suspicion, CBP or this customs authority from the United States can preliminarily hold those imports in the border or at a port facility. This does not mean that they have definitively proven that these are goods manufactured with forced labor, but it is somewhere between a reasonable doubt. Investigations can take a reasonable amount of time. CBP can then authorize the holding of the goods and then start with withholding these goods or seizing them. In practice, the forced labor clause in the U.S. Tariffs Act has increased throughout time. This is related to a legislative change from 2016 that facilitated that customs authorities could impose import bans. We saw a great increase in bans on imports after this was imposed in the United States. We also saw an increase of the institutional capability with this customs authority. This was also necessary because usually customs activities do not have enough expertise and labor issues. And in this case, what happened was that a specific forced labor division was created within customs authorities throughout the United States. In general, these import bans are applied specifically on just a few companies, but occasionally import provisions have been applied to entire sectors, specifically in the cotton sector from Turkmenistan. Next slide, please. It is also worth mentioning that this import ban instrument has gone through a lot of criticism from different places. The lack of transparency in the procedure has been an issue. Evidence procedures, divergent evidence procedures, and the evidence we have for empirical situations from other commercial instruments suggest when these clauses are activated does not necessarily mean that they will have a positive effect when it comes to forced labor. So we believe it is important to have a better understanding of how these import bans do affect the governance of the value chain or the supply chain and labor rights in practice. We currently have an ongoing research project And in
la obra
this,
que presentamos el día de hoy,
in the work
también
we've presented
tuvimos
today, we have also
estudio de caso
included
sobre la
a case
industria
study
de guantes de goma de Malasia.
from the
Y por qué
Malaysian
este sector,
rubber
tal vez se pueda
glove
preguntar,
industry. And you may
porque
wonder about this. Why
realmente
did we
tuvo
pick
un
this?
papel
We picked
bastante
this because this
protagónico
had
en
a pretty
este contexto.
mainstream role
Algunos,
when it comes to this context.
algunos datos de contexto sobre ese
Some of the
sector.
information, just to give you context on the
Malaysia es el líder
sector,
mundial
Malaysia
en
is
la
the
producción
world
de guantes
leader
de goma,
in the production of
principalmente
rubber gloves.
basado en
Thank you for
trabajadores
slide switch,
migrantes.
especially
Y,
using migrant labor.
hay bastantes
And
informes que,
there are
dan
a lot
información,
of
evidencias y
reports
servidumbre
that
por viuda,
substantiate
salarios
this.
indefinidos
There
y
are
otros,
withheld
más,
wages,
importadores de trabajo forzoso,
forced labor,
acerca de
beggary,
estos trabajos
or
indebidos
a
en el
debt
sector de
labor.
guantes de goma.
And this is
Entonces,
all
lo que pasó aquí es que
revolving
se
around
aplicaron,
the glove
se
manufacturing industry.
desde
That is
la
why
autoridad aduanera de Estados Unidos,
from
varios,
CBP in the US,
se llaman WROs, varias,
they call them
prohibiciones de importaciones
WROs, a lot of
preliminares,
preliminary import
incluyendo
provisions,
contra
including
contra el líder mundial de la producción de guantes de
against
gomas.
the world
Y es
leader
importante
on
mencionar la mayoría de estas,
rubber glove
estas
production.
prohibiciones de
And
importación
most of
fueron
these
impuestas
import
en medio
bans
de la
were
pandemia,
actually
o sea, cuando
imposed
los Estados
in the
Unidos
midst of the
realmente
pandemic,
necesitaban
when the
una
United
gran
States
necesidad
definitely
de
needed
esta
or had a
mercancía.
great need for
Entonces,
these types of
mandó una
goods.
señal probablemente bastante
So
fuerte,
this
que
was
esto,
definitely a
es
big
bastante
signal, a
serio.
big call
Y
out
además, en un caso,
to
no
the
solo
industry regarding this
no la
issue,
detención preliminar de los bienes,
and
sino también la incautación
not the
permanente de los productos en
preliminary
cuestión.
origin of them, but actually the actual
El
products.
efecto era una pérdida acumulada
The
estimada
effect
en
of this
ingresos por
was
exportaciones de guantes de
increased
goma de
loss
aproximadamente
of rubber gloves
800
for
millones
approximately,
de dólares
or
de
lost
Estados Unidos.
income. It was
Por
about
supuesto,
$800 million
este
US dollars.
acontecimiento
Of course,
también impactó
this event did
la
impact
confianza de los compradores internacionales
the
en
trust
Malasia
of
como
buyers, international
proveedor,
buyers who were buying from
de
Malaysia,
gomas en general.
and questioned whether they were a right or an appropriate producer
Frente a
for
esta
rubber
situación,
gloves.
las empresas
In the face of this situation, companies that were affected or impacted by these import
adoptaron
bans
varias medidas que en
adopted a
general,
series of measures.
digamos, la investigación empírica
And in
muestra
general,
bastantes efectos
empirical
a
data
diferentes niveles
shows a lot of
que,
effects at different
estos
levels
import bans han tenido
after these
en
import bans
relación con el sector de guantes de
and what
goma.
effect these import bans have in the rubber glove production market. At a company level, we can say that there are specific measures that were focused on first, recruitment fees, reimbursement. Oftentimes, recruits have to pay a recruitment fee so they can access to the Malaysian labor market, oftentimes so they can enter the country's market. And these fees can actually be very high. They have been very much linked to evidence or to debt bondage. We see here that one of the evidences or one of the measures that were seen most of the times by the companies in question was actually reimbursing those recruitment fees. We also saw some other measures that were focused on structural changes when it comes to HR policies. For example, the practice of withholding migrant workers' documents. There is also evidence for the improvement of dwelling conditions and wages, at least for one of the companies in question. We also saw some effects beyond business-wide effects. There is evidence that highlight that these imports pushed an initiative from the private sector. It is called the Responsible Glove Alliance. This is an industry-wide initiative that commits its members to specific due diligence and transparency requirements. It is likely that import bans were actually an incentive or pushed so that these nationwide and global initiatives were created. Maybe there was some work at a ministry level to focus on the rubber industry or the rubber glove industry, while the connection we can highlight is maybe not as clear. We can still assume that that was the case. What about the potential of import bans? What can we say about this? And they are connected to the structural reasons for forced labor. And this slide is a little bit busy, but the takeaway here is, how does the process work? And that is, the process for imposing these import bans were developed in a great way between U.S. authorities and the rubber glove manufacturing stakeholders and private stakeholders that were actually hired by companies so they could assess or evaluate these companies and see how they would fit with U.S. policies and whether they could be banned from imports. However, there was very little interactions with Malaysian government authorities and civil society stakeholders in that country. And I circle back to sustainability when it comes to import bans, because some observers have interpreted this as a sort of limitation, so much so that it was seen as a lost opportunity, or there were, let's call them, structural barriers when it comes to legislation or with institutional frameworks at a national level. Next slide, please.
And as far as this case, I also need to mention that we also have evidence of negative effects of the import ban on workers. And this is a case prior to the pandemic. In this case, due to the evidence, in fact, there is a government report from the US addressing this, that due to the import ban, the migrant workers' employment was terminated, reinforcing the vulnerabilities of the affected migrant workers. And of course, as a migrant worker without a job in Malaysia, it is quite difficult to find a new job. Therefore, these brought adverse effects for workers. And the situation of those workers is not that clear. We're not sure if that situation improved or not. Next slide, please. And as my final reflection on this study case, we could ask if import bans can be implemented in a way that strengthens rather than marginalizes national public institutions. We could also ask, if there is a need for institutional mechanisms to avoid negative effects on workers, and also how to best enable companies to avoid being subject to import bans, because what companies from the affected sectors say is that, well, for a while they were not clear on what to do in order to recover from the import ban. Finally, we could also ask how to best create synergies between import bans due to forced labor and other labor governance mechanisms. And here I would like to briefly mention the connection between those mechanisms. For example, the imports ban and the due diligence approaches. Here we have mentioned that the two regulatory approaches could create an interesting conceptual debate. But at a practical level, at least so far, this does not seem to be that strong. In fact, what we see is that the due diligence in the practice could become a key tool to detect and eliminate possible forced labor problems in the value chain, and it shows compliance with relevant requirements in case of an investigation from customs authorities. And this could be seen by the European Union legislation because before deciding on an investigation, the competent authority should consider any due diligence related to forced labor carried out by the company in question. This is clearly stated in the law. Usually, this information must be provided within 30 working days. And this information would play an important role in deciding whether to open a full investigation or not by the European Commission. Therefore, it will be important for companies to have the relevant processes and the pertinent documentation in place in order to face such a situation. Now, I will speak about my conclusions about this presentation. I will be brief, and we can see that this is a dynamic area with much experimentation and institutional innovation. We can also highlight that specific results depend not only on the design of the instruments in question, but also on the relevant local context. In several studies, in several chapters of this book, we have seen that commercial instruments can be a catalyst for improvements at the labor level, especially when aligned with national stakeholders' pressures. And last, it is important to involve social partners because these could also improve the decent work outcomes of these commercial instruments. And to wrap it up, I would like to say that this is a very dynamic area and we need more research to better understand the impact of commercial tools. For example, for imports ban, we have a very little evidence on how this affects enterprises or workers. And this could be a great potential for more research. And I would like to thank you for your time, your patience, and attention. Thank you very much, and I'll be willing to receive your questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Fran, por la excelente y detallada presentación.
Thank you, Franz, for such a wonderful and detailed presentation. And thanks for sharing all these aspects related to the different commercial tools or instruments. And we will have the participation of Jose Duran, the head of the Regional Integration Unit from the Division of International Trade and Integration from ECLAC. He'll be sharing his comments on the two presentations, and he will give us interesting takes as to the impacts of the regulations on deforestation in several sectors in the region. Thank you, José Durán. The floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Tulio. Quiero primero agradecer
Thank
la
you,
invitación
Tulio. I would like to thank everyone for inviting me to participate in this event. I would like to thank Pelin, France, Virginia, and all the colleagues that took part in this research. If you could please play my presentation. Okay, well, the idea of this presentation is to first share my comments regarded to the two presented volumes. This is a titanic task, as you know, 18 chapters. So before I get into matters, I'd like to mention that we need good metrics and good methodology to analyze this type of work. This is an interesting job, allowing us to bring important, relevant conclusions. Usually, policymakers need these type of conclusions in order to make decisions, and this is useful information for decision makers in all the regions where these studies have been done. I would also like to mention in my presentation some comments and the relevant topics and sections of the works, especially the effects of decent work. And I would like to summarize and share some novelties. And just like Tulio mentioned, I would like to share some works from ECLAC related to the connection between trade and employment, especially an estimation of exports, and give some references on the work that we do in ECLAC related to the impact in employment. So we can strengthen some of the results from the large ILO study on wage and gender inequalities with recent data adapted to the entire region. And then, just like Tulio mentioned, looking into the future, I would like to share results on the impact on employment and the EU deforestation regulation. And then I will share my final reflections. Allow me to first say that there are two volumes, the first one with 10 chapters. And from this first volume, I would like to highlight the relevance or importance of a good analytical structure. It has a section that very well explains all the section of the commercial practices as far as tariffs and quotas and anti-dumping and the voluntary regulations, and also gap indicators, gender gaps, and social security coverage, also providing a good bibliographical reference and literature analysis. Just to share a case, the tariffs go back to the 1930s as a policy measure in the US. So this is rich in definitions and analytics. If we have academic students, this is a good piece in order to analyze the different methodologies. And it also covers the impacts and methodologies, including the partial equilibrium and the computable general equilibrium, and the use of the input product model. So this has very good aspects of literature revisions, indicators, methodologies, and case studies that show the need of this approach, as Pelin well mentioned, a complementary approach that needs to consider the macro, the micro, and meso, including the case of Vietnam and Mexico with SMEs and Malawi, the trade restrictions and their effects on employment by gender. And for the last section, I would like to mention the last section, highlighting the ILO's role driving qualification policies and the transition to formality and the compliance with international commitments to decent work. Putting the ILO at the core of a trade and a decent work. And the idea is to put people at the center, in this case, workers. From the decent work perspective, and in this case, trade could favor decent work. And if a policymaker is considering to make a political decision on the commercial openings, for example, or maybe bringing down the tariffs, or maybe strengthening the protection to local systems or integration systems, decisions need to be made. We have winning and losing sectors. Decisions are to be made as far as increasing the tariffs or signing a trade agreement, and it is important to make decisions on known metrics. And in this sense, the work presented by this book is extremely useful, and it helps us to navigate the literature on trade and decent work. And the second volume complements this very well because it focuses on the analytics of the legal regulatory framework that, just like Fran mentioned, sometimes can be very elusive, and it covers all that. I am not going to get into details. I just want to say that we have a very good case studies and analytics, including gender and the green agreement or the Green Deal. If we can move to the next slide, please.
So, based on the metrics we have, which stems out of informality and some novel indicators that are trying to foster gathering more employer-worker data, that a time excessive work time indicator versus the percentage of people who are working more than 8 hours a week, or 48 hours a week rather. This is trying to focus on the use of these indicators for the analysis and the impact of work. Usually, the work done for policy decision maker consider macro aspects, and it is better to go into formal employment, informal employment, density numbers, urban and regional, at a country level. This study gives us very important data as to how to use these indicators. Can you go to the next slide, please? Now, regarding the effects of trade, openness on employment, trade openness on employment, let me just talk about the positive effects. They are more productive. We go with wages, so we can say that's great. These companies can harness technology a bit more, they can make more changes, and therefore you would end up saying, okay, trade is good from the economic standpoint, but we have to consider that there are some negative effects that could happen, and we've seen them wage inequalities in some countries. Some have been referenced in the text. And companies, as they make these changes in local markets, wages can go down, and then inequalities can happen between qualified and unqualified workers, between men and women. These are unwanted effects. We also see mixed effects, that is that there are winning sectors that gain access to markets, and those who are in the winning sectors increase their labor market demand. So when it comes to trade and the trade employment link, there's definitely an associated cost when it comes to commercial or trade policies, and smaller companies can be affected, or especially those that are focused on local markets. Next slide, please. In order to portray these different results, I will use the three case studies. In the first chapter, this is the Malawi study, where the increase of MFN tariffs was simulated up to 50% on sugar, 18% on tobacco, 70% on rice. They tried to establish some level of tariff protection and look at loss of employment, unskilled employment, and women in the employment sector. In the other case is Mexico, the automotive sector in Mexico, in which the rate of employees living in poverty and low remuneration did not increase, nor did the gender gap increase, which is very good. And the automotive sector, which has been growing without there being clear benefits on workers. The rate of employment and poverty did not go down, or the working poor rate did not go down. And there are also imported goods, especially from the United States, had a different rate. And the case of Vietnam is interesting, where the study highlights the need for using micro sets of data, trying to foster policies that favor placing employees or workers and their quality of life expectations as the first line. And this is interesting because this study demonstrated that with complementary policies, you are able to promote decent employment and also having a better share of women in the workplace and younger people or youth in the workplace. And my takeaway is that these are mixed effects. You can have positive or negative effects, but there is a need to implement complementary policies, and this has been well portrayed in the study or in the different studies. Go ahead, please. Next slide. On the case study and conflicts or disputes in trade agreements, I would like to say that in the last portions of this, what is worth mentioning is how we see the possibility for cooperation whenever there is a dispute, a trade dispute focused on labor situations. These disputes were actually resolved through cooperation, where in countries that have advanced systems helped other countries, they were able to do good review or good revision of the dispute, and they were able to resolve it properly or in a better way, in a more favorable way. So this is an avenue of analysis out of the different treaties and technical cooperation so they can hone down on employees and improving labor conditions for developing nations. Next slide, please.
Al estudio sobre prohibiciones de importación de vías a trabajo forzado.
Regarding forced labor provisions or import bans due to forced labor, I would like to highlight that this study has highlighted or underlined the need for good governance on this, and a provision such as this one, like an import ban, a ban that will affect economic performance. In the case of the Malaysia example, there is a ban on them from importing their goods into the United States, led them to make decisions and focus on changing and making changes that would promote better working conditions, better wages, recruitment fees, return documents, and improve wage conditions for their workers, which is definitely positive. And then the private sector reacted quickly, and they put together this due diligence scheme, and this stimulated or incentivized local governments to improve labor laws. This is pretty much a forced exercise, an induced exercise. Obviously, it is in the best interest of companies to continue to export. That is why they improved conditions, because it was in their best interest. So they had to improve the conditions of the stakeholders that were making their exports complicated. So, and just like Frank said a while ago, it is important to be able to push for measures and dialogues between the private sector and the public sector in an anticipated way in order to get ahead of the curve, so that a provision such as this one can maybe impact revenues, the revenues of the country in this case. But we should also try to guarantee that companies do comply with domestic legislation when it comes to protecting workers and decent work. And this is a very difficult balance to get when you have pressures from different places, so you have to prepare in advance. So the study focuses on this, and this is very important. You have to anticipate that this will be a situation, and there should be an organism that will help companies to be prepared for this type of situation. Next slide, please. Having said this, allow me to show you some results on employment and trade. Next slide, please. Now, for Latin America, we estimate that in the region there are approximately 35 million jobs linked to exports, 23 million men, 12 million women. This is 35 million throughout the region, spread out throughout the region, and there is more employment for men than for women. This is something we should pay attention to. Next slide, please. And allow me to mention as well that in the studies that ECLAC does on impacts, we've did a recent one on the impacts of an agreement between Ecuador and China. We need prompt sets of information so we can take a look at the red lines, winners, losers, and ultimately make a decision that is beneficial to both nations. Next slide, please. Also, on wage gap between men and women, here at ECLAC, we did an analysis on wage gaps, separating high exporter companies versus other exporting industries, so the agricultural sector. And we've seen that high exporting industries have
entre hombres y mujeres. O sea,
wider
la brecha es
wage gaps between men and women. So in these high exporting industries, you will see a higher gap or a bigger gap versus what you would in a services industry and industries that are more focused on the local market. Can you go to the next slide, please? So on average, so 12 countries here, when you analyze the wage gap and you take a look at income wage gaps and you take a look at it on a per sector basis, you can see that companies or sectors that are focused on the local labor market versus those who are exporters, there is a bigger gap when it comes to high income earners. So between 2011 and 2018, you can see the wage gap is quite similar. In the 90 percentile, women see lower wages than men. This is quite serious and something we have portrayed in our work. Next slide, please. And now I would like to talk about and mention that regulatory changes and their impact on employment when it comes to forced labor, in the case of the EU deforestation regulation from May 2023, this one is trying to have the EU to contribute with deforestation issues, or to help with deforestation issues, has put some exporting sectors in the region in a bit of a bind. This legislation is not applicable, but it has been adopted already, and there are some pertinent products that are linked to deforestation, like soy, coffee crops, wood, palm oil, bovine, or rubber, or cocoa, where the region has an important exports. So coffee, 16% of it goes to Europe. Palm oil, 50% or 18%. So as of 2024, or maybe January next year, a lot of these products, and due to the need of exporters to prove that their crops are free from deforestation measures, as they have to prove that their procedures or their crops are not causing deforestation, and you have a series of traceability requirements to prove that these crops are free from deforestation. This puts employment at risk, and because forced labor bans and others. So maybe it could be the case that in all these products, you can have some issues with employment. Here at ECLAC, we've looked at the effects on employment when it comes to direct and indirect employment on a per product basis, and we've seen that about 4 million jobs would be affected by this deforestation regulation, especially for crops like coffee, palm oil, soy, and those millions of jobs. And when it comes to countries, next slide, please.
Brazil, Peru, Colombia, Honduras, especially those countries that have employment with intensive agricultural sectors. And now let's move to the conclusions. First, I would like to say that there is a need to conduct more case studies that consider decent work indicators, a good metric, employment density breakdown by gender. The use of administrative records is important. And as the book highlights it, there is a need to use employment, social security, and microdata indicators. As far as the policies, it is important to use complementary policies that drive and give a better qualification to the labor workforce and adequate remote work, formalization of workers, the promotion of qualifications linked to the core business. Training is important on sales, logistics, and marketing for workers. It is also important to highlight this aspect. It's good to have good metrics, but especially it's important to make sure that the worker is at the core, at the center. And I would like to highlight the need for state members to respect the international labor standards. And here I would like to mention a few of them, avoiding forced labor, for example. So we can avoid child labor, to have fair wages for men and women. And I would like to say that on the ECLAC's work on trade and employment in light of the ILO approach, we have been able to prove that we are in the same path. In ECLAC, we are concerned with the importance of good metrics and having the right data for decision making. The study highlights all these throughout the 2 volumes. It is important to highlight the relevance of the analysis of the possible effects on employment and the changes in the policy, for example, trade agreements and tariffs and import bans. And it is also important to respect the legal requirements as far as making the necessary regulatory changes in order to prove that there's no forced labor involved. And in the case of a deforestation, there will be due diligence requirements where employers will have to prove that their crops are not coming from deforested lands and the effect that it has on employment. Therefore, it is important that throughout all the levels and the actors involved to have wage inequalities studies. Another conclusion of the work presented is important. We need to include those sectors that are potentially affected. These are green topics, these are new topics, and they are also part of the conclusion of the work on the Green Deal. But at the end, everything connects to labor standards. I would like to say that if you are an employer listening to me now, you need to make sure to do all the efforts so your company is well served, respecting the labor standards so your country can be benefited with the good impacts and being able to take advantage of commerce. Trade, commerce helps to reduce poverty levels and improving the income level. It is important for employers to contribute by improving the labor condition of their workers. And it is also important for workers to increase the productivity, reacting to the good stimuli from employers. So we have to move towards the same direction. We need to favor decent work. We need to respect standards, and it is important to pay back with more productive work. I'm saying this because we have representatives from trade unions in this meeting. Therefore, it is important to consider all the angles. The ILO and the colleagues that have done these studies set the bar very high, providing evidence on the need to advance in a coordinated manner to dialogues and mechanisms that could put workers in the first line, at the center. Thank you, Tulio, and I give you the floor back. Thank you, Jose Duran, for sharing your comments and interesting results indicating the gender gap and the impact and the application of some of the instruments like the deforestation in different sectors in the region. We are almost reaching the end of the webinar. An important thing to mention is that we have the Q&A session and it is open for the participants. Please feel free to ask your questions to the panelists. This is the beginning of the Q&A session, and we will have a brief participation of the workers and employers so they can share their stand. We will start with Jacqueline Alvarez, president of the Industrial Chambers of the Mexican States. Jacqueline, I'll give you the floor so you can briefly share your comments and the stance of employers on these important topics that are being discussed in the webinar. Jacqueline, I give you the floor.
Buen día a todos. Y la verdad es
Thank
que el
you.
poder escuchar este resumen
Hello, everyone.
de expertos de cómo lo han realizado es
Being able
interesante para
to
el sector
hear
patronal,
this
porque
summary
entonces
is
entiendes cuál
extremely
es el origen
important
de las reformas
because
para que ellos
by
puedan
doing
tener
so, we can
estos
understand the origin of the reforms. These reforms connect to the objective commented by the ILO, putting the humans at the center, finding a way to improve the quality of life of people
y qué tienen que hacer las organizaciones empresariales,
and
gobiernos, sindicatos,
what
para
governments,
juntos
trade
tener
unions,
camino,
and
hacer una
organizations
brecha y
need to
puedan
do
tener un mayor
so
equilibrio
together we
respecto a los
can
temas
close a gap
socioeconómicos.
and
Es
get
increíble que
achieve a better
con,
impact.
en pleno
It is
siglo XXI
incredible
estamos
because
inmersos en una
we
globalización
are in
con
the 21st
formas de
century
trabajo distintas a
submerged
través de
with
plataformas
different
digitales.
working
Tenemos todavía estas precariedades en el tema
considerations and
laboral
different
respecto a
digital
la
platforms.
explotación laboral,
We still have
jornadas inhumanas,
labor exploitation,
sueldos que, salarios que no son
wages or
realmente los
salaries that
beneficios que
are
se deben de generar de
actually
acuerdo a
not
estos
the
tratados
impact that we want
internacionales
to
que se han firmado.
create
En
connected
este
to
punto específico me international gustaría comentar qué ha pasado
treaties.
con el TEMEC
And in
en
that
México.
aspect, I would
Si
like
bien
to
es
share
cierto,
what has happened with
el tratado
TECMEC
civil
in
hace más de
Mexico.
20 años
This
de la
treaty was
renovación,
signed
que fue
over
el
20 years
2020, se
ago,
incluyen
and
capítulos
in
muy
2020,
específicos
we
respecto a
included
la negociación
specific
laboral.
chapters
Gracias a
on
este tratado
the labor
internacional es que
negotiation.
México
Thanks
modernizó
to
sus
the
leyes y
international
se
treaty,
adecuó para
Mexico
tener una
was able
mayor
to
libertad sindical.
update
Incluso se
the
incluye un mecanismo
legislation.
de
We
respuesta
included
rápida que
a
es muy
rapid
innovador y
response
que hoy México
mechanism.
está siendo
It is
partícipe
extremely
para
innovative,
tratar
and
de que con
Mexico
este mecanismo
is
de respuesta
trying
rápida
through
se
this
puedan
rapid response mechanism.
resolver todas aquellas
We are trying
controversias
to
derivadas
solve or
de las
address
violaciones
those
a la
issues
libertad
that
de la
stem from
sindicalización.
the
Hoy
violations to the right
tenemos grato de
to
comentar que
unionize.
México a través
I
de
would
estas
like to
modificaciones
mention
que
that
se hicieron
Mexico,
primero en la
and through the
Constitución
different
en
modifications done
2017 y después se
to the
materializaron en la Ley
Constitution in
Federal del Trabajo en
2017
2019,
and
los
then in
trabajadores pueden elegir
2019,
a sus representantes
workers
sindicales,
can
a los
choose their
sindicatos,
own
a través
union
del voto personal,
representatives through
libre,
a
directo y secreto.
free, direct,
Por más
and a secret
quizás
vote.
absurdo que pueda parecer esto, pues en México no
Even
tenemos
though
esa
this might
plena
sound
libertad para poderlo
absurd,
realizar
in
de esta
Mexico,
forma.
we
Y
did
sin
not have
embargo,
the
gracias
freedom
a
to do
estos
it this
mecanismos que
way.
se están
However, thanks
realizando,
to the
México está
mechanisms,
adecuando si
Mexico
bien es cierto,
is
el Tratado de Libre
changing
Comercio, de
its
acuerdo a lo
laws,
que pude
even though the free trade agreement,
encontrar y
according to the story
leí muy
shared,
entusiastamente, pues no tenemos todavía esa brecha salarial
we
que quisiéramos
don't
para cerrar,
have
a pesar
that
de que sabemos son
salary
las tarifas
gap,
por
even
hora
though
cuando
that there
las
was
podamos
a
negociar con
minimum
alguna
wage per
automotriz.
hour
Sin
for
embargo, pues
workers in the
sería bueno
automotive
tener esta
sector.
sensibilización
However,
del por qué se están dando estos
employers
cambios
need to
en una
know
mejora
the
continua,
why of the
entendiendo que un
changes,
trabajo en
always
equipo implica
understanding that
mejores condiciones de
teamwork
trabajo para los
between better working conditions
empleados
for
que llevan a ello a una mayor
workers
productividad.
will
Y
lead
sí,
to a
seguir
higher
trabajando
productivity.
de la mano
And we needed to continue working with the government to carry out the necessary efforts to respect the laws. It is important to mention that just a week ago, we published the law to prevent and eradicate human trafficking. And in this law, we will consider a crime when workers work more than the allowed time allotted in Mexico. In Mexico, we have different working times, but we have an allowed extra time, and it cannot be more than 9 hours a week. So that time that exceeds the maximum allowed could be considered as a crime. I am not going to delve into the details, but that extra time in Mexico allowed will not be sanctioned, but that extra time exceeding the allowed time is going to be considered as human trafficking. It is important to raise awareness with employers so they know that this is leading us to precarious work and the challenges that we have to work with the ILO unions and the governments will help us work as a team. I really enjoyed the first intervention when they mentioned that the ILO's goal is to work with people, and we need to share that idea with the workers and the trade unions and government, because by doing so, we can reach better agreements. I would like to say that even though the free trade agreement represents 83.4 of our exports and 45.9 of the imports in Mexico, 64% of the total trade for the country. This means that the automotive industry is extremely important for the Mexican sector. However, we need to care for the labor relations so there are no longer, we don't have any more inequalities in Mexico. Thank you, and I would like to congratulate everyone for your participation. I really enjoy this work. Thank you for sharing valuable information. Thanks. Thank you, Jacqueline Alvarez, for sharing your comments and ideas from the employers sector. Now, let's move to the workers of the Americas so we can hear their ideas on what we heard so far. The floor is yours, Juan.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for having me on behalf of TUCA Trade Unions Group and the Regional Unions Group. I would like to congratulate ILO for this very important piece of work, pretty comprehensive work that provides us with a broad set of inputs so we can continue to come up with answers for the region, for the world, and for the region specifically, so we can focus more on decent work levels in our countries, which is most definitely a key challenge, and we are very far from achieving. TUCA's contribution that comes out of an effective development effort, and we would like to share, which focuses on putting decent work and life in the center of the development model. That is why it is key to talk about the characteristics of production, consumption, distribution mechanisms, and focusing on better life conditions and better working conditions, as well as the production of healthy products and the reduction of negative impacts on territories, the environment, attempting to fight climate change. And that development part of it has a political, strategic part of it, which is regional integration. Union movement and some other partners to the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas and other sectors of society understand that integration is key. It is the means, a key and essential means, so we can build truly inclusive instruments that has work or labor and people in the center of it, and that focuses on democracies and prevent attacks on democracies throughout our countries and the rise of the far right, and also pushing against colonizer intentions that may threaten the sovereignty of peoples. That framework focused on development and focusing on regional integration, inserted into the analysis of commercial development or trade development to decent work, just like the study says it, compels us to place ourselves in global trade conditions that has a series of conditions, especially in the global south, and attempting to restructure those value chains, those supply chains, just like the pandemic, the war on Ukraine and the invasion on Ukraine and the changes this has brought about when it comes to energy. All of these are definitely important aspects. So out of that, I would like to say maybe two or three short things. First of all, the region has had different international insertion attempts, but when it comes to trade, and they have been homogeneous. They haven't all gone in the same direction. And some of them have been imposed by bigger positions of power in the world economy. It has been characterized by unilateral, liberalizing trends, some free trade agreements with the US or the EU. We can see this in the Andean region in Central American countries, while, especially in the South, in our region, strategies have not been so much clearly focused on that, and there's been more of a regional integration, even though it has been somewhat difficult. I'm actually referring to Mercosur and a free trade agreement that is intra-regional. If it happens, they're still discussing it nonstop. The EU and Mercosur are trying to integrate with one another. These are not in opposition of, and those countries that are trying to get a free trade agreement-based integration with some other regions have not been able to have regional integration processes that have been articulated properly with partner countries that will facilitate a trade agreement that is a common extra block agreement. This is detrimental to the development of trade integration in the region. I would like to say something that comes out of the document that I think is very informational. Commercial integration or trade development is not necessarily associated to informality in the workplace or informality in our economies. Our economies see this a lot because of the high levels of informality in our region. So any sustainable answer to Latin America and the Caribbean, and therefore any trade and investment strategy, has to focus very much on bringing down informality. If that is not the case, we cannot expect to have a real development. So when we think about commercial integration, we need to place those strategies and actions and the roads that contribute to a better regional development, including trade development, and that do definitely cater to issues in our region, such as informality and focus on decent work. And we have to say that. Inserting social and labor clauses in free trade agreements for our region can definitely foster an improvement or a contribution, they are actually far from being a compelling answer with real impacts. These look more like lukewarm initiatives attempting to build instruments that are actually binding, legally binding, as a matter of fact, due diligence. Even if we were to admit that this is some progress and some improvement, is still, in its essence, a voluntary mechanism for companies, and it is still far from being mandatory. So the agreements inserted into TUCA and CCI need a binding attempt focused on human rights, and we bet on the work that the United Nations is doing, focusing on human rights, and they will have a meeting in Geneva in October in 2024 to commemorate, hopefully, its 10th anniversary, and we hope that some progress is made there. Where we see a lot of these initiatives have backpedaled and fallen back into not being able to reinforce what these mechanisms should have. So in a region of the world where regional integration is very weak and still has a lot for us, left for doing, there are a series of clauses for labor divisions, and we want to look at something more classical, and some experts are focused on primary products, and where instruments for rebuting those weaknesses. Well, in all of this, the union movement understands that we need a reform of multilateralism, and we have been given an opportunity to face all that, and we do acknowledge ILO, and we see ILO as a key stakeholder and partner in all of this. But we expect ILO to guide a tripartite agreement for the region. And just to wrap up, two things here. It is important that in all of this, ILO can actually contribute to the process that is happening at the OECD level and also in the UN when it comes to tax reform at a corporation level, and reforming legislation in different states when it comes to tax issues. This will foster decent work so we can hopefully consolidate universal, solidary, and inclusive systems that focus on social protection, and also to improve tools so we can face climate and environmental crises, which is one of the biggest challenges of our time. Sorry for going a little bit over, but thank you for having me. Thank you very much, Juan Martinez, for your great comments. And now we will open it up for questions and answers. We have our questions in the chat box, so you can ask your questions. Let me just start with a question coming in from our regional director. This is on, let me just ask if France about this. This is on integration between regulatory systems, ban imports, and due diligence, and the companies that hire other companies that oftentimes do not worry about ensuring or making sure that the due diligence process and all those other worker protection mechanisms move forward. So how does this process, or what does this process look like when it comes to these instruments, and when you have a company hiring other companies to manufacture goods? How can we actually verify that we're doing right by people and doing due diligence? I will hand it over to France. Thank you very much, Tulio. This is an important question, which speaks to the heart of some of the issues
de las cadenas de suministro, ¿no?
that we see when it comes to supply chains. I do not have a definitive answer, but I will talk about the expectation, and maybe the short answer is that in order to approach this issue, we need mechanisms or initiatives that are new or additional mechanisms, because import bans and due diligence legislations have their limitations when it comes to this unbalance between contracting companies and contracted companies. And when it comes to imports, the contractor would have some level of incentive to make sure they comply with what the hiring company needs so they can avoid import bans. However, what evidence suggests is that contracting companies in question are adopting a risk minimizing approach instead, and doing this in their problem areas or problem sectors instead of approaching their contractors to make sure their contractors provide people the right conditions and help them so they can have a little bit of more leg room so they can pay their employees better and treat them better. Oftentimes in this situation, we notice that the company ends up distancing from these contractors or severing their ties with these contractors. The due diligence legislation. So the questions here are a little bit open, but based on what we know and with some of the corporate stakeholders that we know about, what we know is that some of the due diligence legislation incentives that are out there have not been properly articulated, maybe, so they can approach this unbalance between the contracting company and the contractor, so that there is a risk for contractors or contracting companies will delegate labor right obligations to their contractors without paying attention to the economic side of it and what this delegation can cause. These are some of the preliminary issues that come up out of some of the preliminary studies focused on the German legislation when it comes to due diligence in supply chains. But of course, it is early in the game, so we can have a final conclusion. However, we should not be too optimistic that these initiatives we have referenced here today will actually change these dynamics. As a matter of fact, we need more debate, more dynamics, and more discussion so we can solve this.
Thank you very much, Francis. So this is a difficult question. Now I would like to redirect to a topic that we see in the chat, informality. Here, I would like to give the floor to Pauline, so we can get more space for other questions. For example, if there is any evidence that the informality aspect is explicitly addressed in the social clauses in commercial agreements or trade agreements. And here we can include some other questions from informality that we have in the chat. Peline, if you can briefly answer this question and maybe give your reflections on informality. Thank you.
Thank you, Tulio. I would first like to thank for these interesting comments and very nice words about our publications. It's very important for us that it resonates with you, our messages. So concerning informality and also other working conditions, our main finding is that, in fact, there is no one type of effect on different working conditions. We have very different findings in the literature about how trade affects various working conditions, including informality. Especially for informality, we see that in some countries it has increased, it has led to a decrease in informality, but in some countries, opening to trade has led to an increase in informality. So in the case of Vietnam, in the study that I presented, there was a connection between exporting and informality, but this is a very particular case because Vietnam is very well integrated in international trade and they have benefited from many investments. And also the country has started many legislations on social protection. So it is not the message is that the trade only itself alone, it cannot really lead to decent working conditions in every country or in every sector. A trade opening needs to be complemented by other policies, such as social protection policies. There are trade policies which can be used, which can be oriented to improve working conditions. And I would like to send you about that to the 9th chapter in the first volume, because there is a chapter which looks at these questions, especially how trade can be used, can be leveraged to improve informality. And it goes through some policies such as diversification through trade or participation in global value chains or using e-trade, commercial digitalization to improve informality. But in all cases, it is important to note that they have to be supplemented by other policies, for example, skills policies, or providing support to SMEs so that they can identify these skill needs. So trade itself, it cannot really it cannot create decent working conditions in all cases. And the other question about the mentioning of informality in trade agreements, maybe Franz would have a better answer than me, but I don't think that it is mentioned as such so much. This is not a question. This is not an issue that the labor provisions referred to directly, as much as I know.
Thank you, Pelin. Franz, if you want to make very brief comment about that.
Yeah, very briefly. So as Pelin said, I might just add that indeed informality is often not directly addressed in the context of the labor provisions. Arguably because it's difficult also to regulate, but it hasn't come up as a very frequent topic in those trade agreements. With regard to SMEs, some chapters have, some agreements have chapters now on small and medium enterprises. Aparentemente me dicen que debería hablar en español. No hay problema. Entonces,
okay, I'm sorry, I'm being asked to speak in Spanish. I was saying that the newest agreements have chapters on SMEs, focusing especially on the promotion of the SMEs' economic conditions. And sometimes they are not directly connected to labor standards. There are few cases in which these topics are addressed, but usually in an isolated manner in FTAs. Maybe we could try to connect the labor aspects and the SMEs conditions in some sectors that would yield to an interesting regulatory idea. It's been criticized that the labor standards or the labor provisions in FTAs are usually coming in the last part, and they are not directly connected or linked to those provisions, for example, the engine room for those agreements. And here we could consider, for example, different mechanisms. So FTAs or maybe economic provisions could have adverse events for workers. This is something that I could think, for example. It is important to reflect on a better inclusion of those topics in FTAs, including SMEs, etc. This could be a useful reflection. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Franz. Y por último, la última pregunta que tenemos en el chat.
Thank you, Franz. And the last question that we have in the chat from Jose Duran. He's asking about the impact for agroindustrial workers if there are no labor standards for exports. And this is in the same line of a sectorial estimates that you shared. If you can make a brief reflection on this question. Thank you. Yes, when there is a sector that does not respect the labor standards or does not abide to labor standards, from the employer's standpoint, if the employer is paying wages below the average or subcontracts, someone might say that they are getting some profit or a margin because there are extraordinary income by the excess of the worker's salary. But from the wider standpoint, when we consider the competitiveness, if the employer pays the overtime and offers a good salary and trains workers, or actually favors providers, because this could be an exporting company and buys to small producers. And if small producers have good standards in the fields and they have good income, well, in the end, the productivity will go up. So the employer that does not comply with the labor standards, and this is important in the industry. I know a case, a very poor area in Paraguay, Casapal. We do a study on the impact of trade in poverty, and the small producers, orange producers or citric products for exports through large enterprises. They were better off when large companies would provide technical assistance and would pay them better, because at the end, their products were better, and that had a positive impact in the competitiveness of the exporting company. So what's the contribution of the trade in solving poverty and inequalities? Well, the idea is to be able to guarantee decent working conditions that can actually stimulate the competitiveness of the products. And this is an important aspect in agricultural sectors. It's not the same to have a company producing or exporting soy palm with precarious labor conditions. I'm sorry, palm oil and another company that actually complies with all the labor standards. So I would like to say that the main risk is being competitive, quite contrary to what a company might think. A company that wants to maximize income, but in the end, the income is underserved when there are imports bans or maybe serious aspects. If in a banana field, for example, there's no good caring practices of the product, and at the end, the big company is going to have a reputational problem. This is my question. This is my answer to that question. And I would like to mention something about SMEs. In the economic aspect, SMEs are considered, for example, public procurement. So usually we offer preferential agreements to SMEs, and this stimulates formality because a company that gets benefits usually complies with specific requirements. So this is a good example. Another example is to harness commercial relations. When an agreement is being made, usually the actors at risk can mention their employment issues, and this is a good time for the policymakers to create the right conditions for complementary policies favoring decent work. From our experience in ECLAC, this is the right moment to highlight the policies associated to the enforcement of an agreement. I give you the floor back, Tulio. Thank you, Jose Duran, for your answer, and thank you for the considerations on SMEs and a clear message to take advantage of the negotiation opportunity. This is important to prepare everything so the end results in terms of labor and social results to be a little bit more visible. Okay, we are getting to the end of the webinar, but I would like to invite our ILO regional director to share the final remarks, and then we can move to the end. And Virginia, I can allow me to give you the floor. Thank you. I would like to thank everyone for the participation, and I would like to congratulate the ILO's research team for such an important publication. I believe that today we learned about the reason why we need good data on the complex relation between labor and international trade. This study shows the importance of having the right institutions to ensure that the effects of development in commercial terms can bring inclusive and sustainable development that leads to decent work and to a greater social justice. This is our task, and this publication actually helps in this moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ana Virginia. Now we will go to our closing session with Marla Corley. Marva will share her closing remarks. She is the head of the ILO Globalization Unit, and she has been the person who led all the work for the reports that we saw today. Marla, you have the floor.
I led the work, but I had a magnificent team working with me, as you can tell. I want to first congratulate Piline and Franz for excellent presentations today and for generating such wonderful feedback. I'd also like to thank Anna Virginia and Tulio, you as well as the entire team in the regional office for organizing this seminar and for bringing this great group of stakeholders together to discuss this very important issue. We've really appreciated the valuable feedback that we've received, in particular from Jose Duran, who's made a strong business case for labor standards, as well as our employer representative, Jacqueline Alvarez, and the workers representative, Juan Martinez. I won't belabor the time here today. I'd just like to say a few closing things before we conclude. I wanted to provide some takeaways from the discussion. I took some notes during this event, and I want to attempt to sum up. The discussion was very rich. It was very diverse. I don't have it in my power to be able to do that. But there are a few things which I think might be important to sort of bang home to the participants, and just some things that we should all be mindful in terms of follow-up. I think one of the key things throughout our discussion today was this emphasis on the importance of sustainability. It was said in different ways, but I think both directly and indirectly, the core issue is about short-term profits over long-term sustainability. It's very evident from the literature that trade does bring about prosperity. There are numerous advantages. You see many articles. You see a lot of research about its role in alleviating poverty, promoting economic growth, and also it has done a very good job in terms of closing the gap between rich and poor countries. However, one thing that we've been trying to pay more attention to, and it's important to acknowledge that there are many costs associated with these developments. Not all workers have benefited in the same ways, either with respect to real wages, access to employment opportunities, access to social protection that's needed in order to be able to transition, to move through the transitions that might be caused by trade. And likewise, as we've been discussing as well with respect to firms, particularly small and medium enterprises, as well as those in the informal sector, they've not been able to transition as smoothly as well. And this is also a point that was mentioned by Juan Alvarez, and it came up, Juan Jose Duran, and also it came up in the discussion as well as one of the key points of the questions from the participants. So how can we better enhance the integration of trade and decent work? Maybe there are three key points I want to take away with. First is the crucial issue of benchmarking decent work. To be able to address an issue, we first need to be able to see it, to visualize it. And we have to be mindful of the various factors that come into play when we're assessing the impact of trade on the labor market. Job creation is crucial. But the creation of good jobs that pay a living wage, jobs that provide access to social protection, jobs that enable decent working hours, that's even better. So we need to make a focused effort to expand the range of indicators that we're using when we're analyzing the impact of trade in the labor market. And this is something that Jose Duran brought up as well. It's evident that there are challenges with respect to data availability. Really, we need to think about the importance of highlighting this at the national level, making this a priority. We need more effective tools for collected data, for monitoring data, and for the dissemination of these results. And that will really help us to first assess much better what are the challenges with respect to trade on the labor market. The second point I'll bring up has to do with mainstreaming decent work in macroeconomics and in trade policy. And this is something I think that Juan Alvarez was referring to when he started talking about, there are other policies as well. We need green policies. What about tax reform? So there's a whole of government approach here. And it's crucial for the different government agencies to collaborate and to think about the implementation of policies that complement each other rather than conflict each other. Putting in place, policies, trade policies that help support decent work, while on the other end having financial policies that don't, it just leads to sort of a policy mess. So we really need to shift our priorities from thinking about labor markets merely as flanking measures in all cases, and instead prioritizing workers, prioritizing small and medium enterprises, and thinking more about the centralization of this in not only trade policies, but macro policies more general. The third point, and that came up, Jacqueline mentioned this as well, about the importance of cooperation and social dialogue. And that's something that really cannot be overstated. And this comes out a lot in our research. Compliance, of course, compliance, inspections. This is super important, as well as different mechanisms for dispute settlement. But one thing that we found most important is the establishment of platforms that encourage engagement and dialogue among stakeholders. And this is starting from the very beginning of trade negotiation and continuing as permanent structures throughout the process of trade liberalization. Just a couple more points. I think it's important here also to acknowledge the common goals that trading partners have. And one, the importance of expending the necessary, both political capital on one side, in other words, getting the political will to do what needs to be done, as well as the financial resources to back them up. And development cooperation has played a very crucial role here in terms of strengthening institutional capacity to be able to tackle some of the underlying issues that are hindering the progress towards decent work. And here the ILO plays a very important role with our stakeholders in shoring up a lot of these institutions. The final point I'm going to make, and this comes sort of full circle to how Pauline started out, in terms of this is a timely and timeless issue. And it's timeless also in the sense that if you think about it's very important now, and it's a very important issue for years to come, and thinking about the future of trade. I was reading an article in the FT this morning, and it was discussing about the intersection of AI and trade. And there was a whole reflection about the period of hyperglobalization and manufacturing and whether it's come to an end. I could say a couple of things here. One, trade is not losing its momentum, but rather it's undergoing some profound structural shifts, certainly more towards regionalization and also to more service-oriented trade. So when we look at the future, we'll definitely have trade that is more regional and more service-oriented. And so as we conclude this seminar, it's really important to reflect on how we can avoid repeating the mistakes of the past in manufacturing and agricultural, and instead find ways to extend the benefits of trade to a broader range of countries, broader range of enterprises, broader range of workers in a way that is more green, that is more digital, that is more sustainable. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tulio.
Bueno, con esto encerramos nuestro
Very well.
webinario.
With this, we will wrap up with our seminar. I would like to thank our panelists very much. Thank you to our participants who were with us for the past 2.5 hours. Kind regards to all of you, big hugs, and we hope to see you again in another session. Thank you very much. Thank you to all our participants. Thank you. Jose Duran says goodbye. Tulio says thank you.